All right. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our seminar. Something special today. John Lynn and the LAIR group are presenting today, and LAIR standing for Land Atmosphere Interaction Research. Okay, so let's start, and like all of you can present today.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Thomas. When Thomas asked me to present as part of the seminar series, I thought, well, instead of having to listen to me, it would be even better if you actually listen to the fantastic people that do this work on a day-to-day basis. So I sort of thought about a different format today, sort of tag team, which I'll start off and close, but really most of the time will be devoted to the various people. So this is the actual batting order. So after me, I'll hand off things to Louis, Lauren, Aaron, Megan, Maria, Haley, and James. Okay. There are more people, as you can see in the photo, but for various reasons, not everyone can be here in person. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is land-atmosphere interactions and carbon exchange. Okay, and we have a geographic focus where we are in the Western US, but very important, we also have various scales. And to highlight that, I am going to show this kind of organizing slide. It's a really nice one that Aaron here has made, and it highlights the different scales we work in. We're going to start off at the regional scale and then zoom into the sub-regional, and then finally to really local scale here in the Salt Lake Valley. Okay, and there are various themes you'll see from today. We are looking at exchange of carbon, and that especially is focused on CO2 and methane, CO2 and CH4, two of the key greenhouse gases we're looking at. And then along the way, you also see the fact that when you burn fossil fuels, you have emissions of CO2 and methane, but also there's other pollutants as well. So NOx, PM 2.5, CO are being emitted. So there's a very strong linkage between these emissions of greenhouse gases and air quality. And that sort of linkage is also a big theme in our research group. In our research group, we do measurements, especially here on the more local scale, but also here. We make use of satellite data, and we also combine various models in these models. Okay, so this is our organizing slide. You'll see it throughout the talk, and then each person will highlight the scale they're working on. Okay, so you can orient yourself. So without further ado, let me pass the baton to Louis.
Yeah, I'm Louis Koenig. I'm a fourth year PhD student in the group. And I thought I would just kind of start us off with a really broad introduction to land atmosphere interactions. And to do that, I'm actually zooming back out from regional scale to the global scale, thinking about an Earth system model. And so these kinds of models basically try to integrate and quantify the major hydrological, biogeochemical, and energy cycle processes that are relevant to the Earth system. And then this nexus here is the kind of the interface between land and atmosphere that we focus on. But as John said, we're specifically focused on the fluxes, mostly of greenhouse gases, but also some of these air quality pollutants. And I think of this, the nuts and bolts of this system is really in the natural scale, where we have CO2 uptake and release from plants through photosynthesis and respiration. We also have afforestation and deforestation, off-gassing of methane from various microbial processes, wildfire smoke and VOC emission from plants, dust emissions from the land surface, and also some atmospheric chemistry that interacts with all of this. And so these are all really dependent on characteristics of land biogeochemistry and meteorology and climate. And so there's really a multidisciplinary scope to all of this. But then there's the component that is not shown here that's really important, which is humans. So humans have really altered these processes through urban development, land use change, and burning of fossil fuels. And really, the way that these influence this entire system are very nuanced, and actually creates a major technical challenge just to track these fluxes around the globe at different scales, kind of let alone understanding the feedbacks that they induce into the system. So as John said, this is kind of our mode within the group, is to use measurements and models to try to constrain these. And this can be at a global ecosystem scale, or as small as detecting individual leaks within natural gas pipelines, or estimating leaf level photosynthesis. So, as an Earth system science community, we're getting steadily better at understanding how everything scales up to the big picture. And I'm going to use the global CO2 budget as an example. So this was really, we started really making CO2 budgets for the globe around the 1960s. And since then, we've really, with the help of consistent monitoring, we've learned that fossil fuel emissions have soared in the last 50 years. And amazingly, the ocean and the land have responded and continue to take up about 50% of these emissions. And so let's see. So we're kind of steadily making progress towards getting all the uncertainties minimized and getting closer to solving the budget, really getting to a budget imbalance of zero, but we're not, truly there yet. I mean, a lot of this has been as the result of enhancements and improvements in monitoring techniques, but I'll highlight here the uncertainty in the budget imbalance is still about as large as what we estimate is the entire land sink. So that's still pretty significant. So where is all the uncertainty coming from? Well, yeah, fossil fuels are definitely the most significant source into the system, but we don't really know exactly where and exactly how much greenhouse gases are being emitted around the world. So that's actually contributing a lot of uncertainty to the system. And also understanding this really has huge implications for all the decisions that we make in the next century of fossil fuel consumption. So that's huge, and that's sort of low-hanging fruit that motivates a lot of our work. And also on the sink side, the land or the terrestrial biosphere contributes a massive amount of uncertainty as well, mostly because we don't have a way of really directly estimating net carbon uptake at this scale in particular. And so in addition to this, the terrestrial biosphere is super diverse in terms of species composition, and also the kind of functional response to changes in climate. And because of this, we wind up with a lot of models that don't agree on what the carbon sink is doing right now or 100 years into the future. So that's an example of the global scale. And like John said, we're kind of all going to talk about the scales that we work at and what parts of land atmosphere interactions we focus on within the group. So going back to the regional scale, I'm going to talk about Western US and how we're working to improve estimates of biogenic CO2 uptake. And so first I want to talk about some of Shuli Huo's work. Shuli's a postdoc in our group. And Shuli is essentially working with model data assimilation frameworks, specifically using the community land model to improve the estimates of CO2 uptake in the model. And we can think of this in sort of the Bayesian system, where these land models will put forth sort of a prior estimate of CO2 uptake based on a set of initial conditions and a bunch of process-based equations that essentially dictate what we understand about how photosynthesis is calculated. And then, like I said, basically the challenge here is that we don't have a way to directly measure carbon uptake at these scales. But what we can do is use other driving variables which are more or less observable at these scales, and then use those to kind of update these variables in model world. And so Shuli has been working with satellite-derived data products of snow water equivalent and solar-induced fluorescence and leaf area index to try to constrain the fluxes in the Western US. And she's been specifically working with DART, which is sort of a collaboration with NCAR. And this is using a ensemble Kalman filter. I always get that mixed up. To essentially nudge the model towards what we think is more of the true CO2 uptake. And so Shuli's been doing a lot of good work and very cutting edge work trying to assimilate these variables within CLM to kind of produce optimized fluxes and also kind of understand the biases that are corrected within the model. So then moving a little more towards just the satellite observations, which is some of my work. Again, so kind of the underlying challenge within this field is the fact that we can't directly measure CO2 uptake or photosynthesis from space. But what we can do, and what there's a lot of interest in our field, is trying to understand proxies that we can measure that sort of tell us indirectly what we should estimate photosynthesis to be. And so we've been working with this relatively new satellite measurement, solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, or we call this SIF, which is essentially just a subtle emission of energy from photosynthetically active chlorophyll. So there's a lot of literature that's promising out there in the last 10 years saying that this is a pretty good proxy for photosynthesis, but it hasn't been very well explored in forests that have complex topography. And so something that we published last year in ERL was an analysis of SIF from the Tropomi satellite instrument, basically tracing the seasonal and elevational patterns of SIF and tying it to the main pivot points of light limitation and moisture limitation along this gradient. And we found really great results, which is essentially that it seems to track photosynthesis really well. So that's great. It gives us more confidence for this as a tool in our arsenal. And now we're kind of moving forward to see if we can use SIF as a way to understand how the land carbon sink is changing in response to changes in extremes in climate, particularly drought and the disturbances that follow, like wildfires and bark beetle mortality. And so we've been working with interannual variability of SIF and annual anomalies, basically to see if these can tell us about the overall impact of the 2020 wildfires in California and Oregon. And we see that the 2020 SIF anomaly tracks these patterns pretty well, which should hopefully tell us something about what that event did to the biogenic carbon sink. And then kind of zooming in to a more subtle scale, we're really curious to see if we can also use these SIF anomalies as an early warning metric to tell us about potential risks for bark beetle and drought-induced mortality. And so we are currently kind of wrapping up a bootstrap resampling analysis that is focused on trying to compare mortality-affected forest pixels with control pixels to see if we can understand whether there's a signature in forests which eventually die. And yeah, that's sort of the summary, and look for some future research, the paper that comes out from this. And that's it. I will pass it off to Lauren next.
Maybe time for one question.
Oh yeah, or should we do it at the very end?
It might be better because
A little bit working on forget time, but okay. So if there's no question.
we have like 7 or 8 people. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Louis, for giving us a little bit of an introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Lauren. I'm a master's student under John Lynn, and I do regional scale research using satellite data in conjunction with an atmospheric transport model to determine urban CO2 emissions. And more recently, I've been focusing on what the influence of the biosphere is in extracting urban emissions from space. So I'm just going to build up kind of what framework I use here for my research by introducing 2 models. So a lot of people in the audience might know what STILT is, which was created by John Lynn. I use a variation of that called the calm stochastic time inverted Lagrangian transport model. So just kind of an overview of STILT is that it simulates the transport of greenhouse gases backwards through time by retracing the paths of theoretical particles. The only thing that's different about XSTILT is that it deals with vertically integrated column concentrations. And so this is great for me because I use satellite data. So I can use satellite data as an input to XSTILT. Up kind of on the right here, I just put an example of what an external output may look like of a footprint. And so kind of like where that red is going to be our higher footprint values, which means that the satellite is more sensitive to emissions in those places. And so a higher footprint value would give us more of an idea of where emissions are likelier to come from. And just the way I think about footprints is that they give us a history of the air that is arriving in our atmospheric column. So the second part is also developed by Dr. Dian Wu, and this is the Smurf model. So Lewis had mentioned earlier a little bit about solar-induced fluorescence. So this model uses SIF to model urban biogenic fluxes. So when we're looking at a satellite data, we see both anthropogenic and biogenic emissions. But I'm interested in the urban region and I want to isolate anthropogenic emissions. And so being able to estimate carbon uptake and emissions from vegetation gives us a way to remove that biogenic CO2 and look directly at anthropogenic emissions. And of course, this model changes based off of where you are, seasonality, all that kind of stuff. So I use this framework, which was developed by a postdoc in our group, Kai Wilmot, in order to model these urban CO2 emissions. And so we start by using our OCO2 data. So this is a NASA satellite, and so we use this as an input to XDilt. Then we use XDilt to simulate the influences upstream of the atmospheric column where those satellite measurements are taken. And then we can also use Smurf then to remove the biogenic CO2 and focus directly on anthropogenic emissions. And Kai did some pretty cool work with this. He published this paper here toward a satellite-based monitoring system for urban CO2 emissions. And he essentially used the XDilt footprint and convolved it with a population density data set to come up with emissions per capita values for cities around the world. This is really cool because it's kind of difficult to come up with a standardized approach to monitoring emissions. A lot of cities do self-reporting, and that can be kind of rough because, there's different ways of accounting, or some cities are not developed enough to have the resources to account for their emissions, or there's certain uncertainties that, come from underlying assumptions. And so having a way to standardize tracking urban CO2 emissions is really important and can kind of push us forward to climate mitigation actions. So kind of expanding on Kai's work, I'm interested in using this framework to look at how much impact the biosphere has on extracting anthropogenic emissions from satellites, and how big of an impact the biosphere has in different cities. So for example, I put Seattle and Phoenix, which are two cities I've been working with, which definitely have different vegetation and land cover. And also, what is the difference between seasons? So I just put a general visual here so that everybody can kind of understand what my satellite data looks like. This is just for a Phoenix overpass from OCO2. And that long swath down there is the satellite swath with the red dots indicating a higher observed column CO2 value. And that purple and gray is the surface influence footprint. So again, that the areas that are purple indicate that the satellite is more sensitive to emissions in those areas. And that footprint is what we would convolve with our population density data set in order to get our emissions per capita values. So my work kind of involves investigating different methods of estimating biogenic and background CO2 and how that really allows us to see urban CO2 emissions. So I'm going to pass it off to Aaron for subregional.
A little bit. Yeah, so seems that might be better. Okay. You're going to stand here. Yeah, it might be better.
All right, thank you. My name is Aaron Meyer. I'm a research staff member of the LAIR group. And now, when I was a kid, and likely many of you as well, were probably told, whatever you do, do not stare directly at the sun. Being a bit rebellious and stubborn, I said, not only am I going to stare directly at the sun, I'm going to make my entire career out of it. Thankfully, there's this is scientifically useful because it allows us to examine this sort of subregional or basin scale. So thinking of the basin scale, we can think of Salt Lake City. This is a great place for this, where we are right now. And Lewis and Lauren both introduced the idea that we can use satellites to measure the atmosphere on these broader scales. They give us nice broad spatial coverage, but we have these intermittent overpasses and relatively coarse spatial resolution. my colleagues after me will talk more about in situ monitoring, which is great because it's a continuous measurement. But these monitors are very sensitive to local emissions, and they have limited spatial coverage, basically where you can put them. And so enter what I'm calling the solar column here, which is essentially a semi-continuous measurement when the sun is out, and it blends these regional and local sources, giving us sort of a bridge between scales. So what does this actually look like staring at the sun? Essentially, we set up an instrument on the ground and it collects direct solar radiation. So as the sun passes through the atmosphere, different molecules absorb that sunlight at different specific wavelengths. And we can use different bands of the light spectrum to be able to back out concentrations of gases like CO2, which Lauren talked about, but as well as methane and CO, which a couple of my colleagues will talk a little bit more about later as well. And so we've been fortunate to have really great collaborators at multiple different institutions that have allowed us to use what are the scientific standard of these solar column instruments. They're called EM27s. We've had one on the roof of WBB for almost 3 years now. This is the time series from that, and here's the EM27 on the roof there. We've also been able to deploy it in sort of a field campaign style framework. And something I'll talk about right at the end is a startup that I'm involved with, which is hoping to build and has built some prototypes for what we hope to be the next generation of these sun tracking spectrometers, which are more robust and autonomous and are about an order of magnitude less expensive than the scientific standard EM27. So I'm not going to get too much into the weeds of the analysis, but give you just a quick example of what we can do with solar column data like this. So here's an example day. We have total column concentrations of methane and CO2 on the top, and then the bottom plot here are the wind barbs, where the wind is coming from. You can see here at WBB, we have this in the morning and early afternoon, wind coming off the mountains to the east with relatively low emissions. And then right around 2:30, we have this dramatic wind shift where the wind comes from the west and we're sampling air from the urban core. But relating the concentrations of gases to the emissions, which is what we're really after, can be challenging. So a tool that we use is looking at trace gas ratio, so the ratio of one of these gases to another one of these gases. So in the morning, we're kind of in the noise here. There's not a huge dynamic range between methane and CO2. The methane doesn't co-vary with CO2 very strongly. And in contrast to when this wind shift happens, we can see clearly both in the time series plot, but also in these ratio plots that there's a strong covariation between methane and CO2. And so if we have a good understanding of one of these gases, in our case, we have a pretty good understanding of CO2 emissions in the Salt Lake Valley, thanks to the work of John and plenty of others in the atmospheric science department. We can use these empirical ratios to inform our understanding of methane emissions. So this is one way we can use these instruments, but something I'm even more excited about is a project that was selected by the Department of Energy and is led by IBM that we're crossing our fingers will actually happen. We're kind of in the funding freeze question mark right now. But the idea is to be able to look at these subregional basin scales, particularly in the context of oil and gas, to identify ways that we can better characterize methane emissions. And so what we're after here is how can we measure and look at the atmosphere above a basin and use those measurements to inform our understanding of where emissions are and how big they are. So we've established here that we can use in situ measurements and satellites. We can add in things like aircraft flyovers, mobile stations, and drones to gather more concentration information. And then what I'm most excited about will be our attempt to set up a network of these solar spectrometers where due to their low cost and autonomous nature, we should be able to gather a really unique data set that's never been gathered before, looking at the concentration gradient of a species like methane across an entire subregional area here. And then we can pass that off to a company like IBM, who are really leaders in techniques like data fusion, artificial intelligence and machine learning to try and figure out the best way to use the atmospheric concentration measurements that we're taking and get us to an emissions flux or a surface flux of methane from these oil and gas fields. So a key component of that, because there are a lot of novel techniques here, are some kind of ground truth. And thanks to the work of folks in LAIR, we have these literal ground stations in the Uinta Basin. And I'm going to hand it off to Megan and Maria to talk more about this in situ network that has been built. So Megan, it's all you.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. For those who don't know me, I'm Megan. I'm a lab and field technician for the LAIR group. Back to the sort of roadmap that we have here, we had Lewis and Lauren talking about the regional scale. We had Aaron talk about the sub-regional scale, and now we're going to zoom into the urban and local scale. I'm going to talk about our network of long-term in situ measurements, primarily of the two greenhouse gases that we have been talking about throughout this presentation, carbon dioxide and methane. So the LAIR group maintains a network of field locations all throughout northern Utah. We have them in the Salt Lake and Heber valleys, as well as out in the Uinta Basin. And all of our locations measure carbon dioxide. Most of them also measure methane as well, depending on which instrument is installed at that location. And then some of our locations also measure additional gases such as CO and ozone and things like that. And Haley will talk about that a little bit more coming up. And then we also have this cool mobile platform as well. We have an instrument installed on tracks. So we get a nice mobile characterization of the Salt Lake Valley, which James will talk about in more detail in a few minutes. If you're ever interested in our data, you can go to our website, which is air.utah.edu. And this shows the map of all of our locations. And it shows the current reading from our instruments. So right now we have carbon dioxide selected up in that top right-hand corner, but you can select whatever gas you're interested in, and you can see whatever emissions, current emissions. It's updated about every 15 minutes or so. And then you can also plot up data if you're interested in that as well. But our network kind of has two regions of focus. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Uinta Basin. So Aaron did a great job of explaining kind of the importance of measuring methane specifically in the Uinta Basin. And he mentioned that we have field locations on the ground in the basin. So these three dots here are our field locations in the Uinta Basin. The two red dots are kind of in the heart of the oil and gas drilling areas. So we typically see pretty elevated methane values in those two locations. And then that blue dot there, that is our Fruitland site, and that we use as a background. So we use the baseline methane emissions from that site to really help us quantify the enhancement of methane that we're seeing out of our two sites that are in the oil and gas drilling areas. And I mentioned earlier that this is a long-term network. So we have been continuously collecting data in the Uinta Basin for almost exactly 10 years to the date. So this allows us to also characterize how emissions change over time. So in addition to the Uinta Basin, we are also focused on the Salt Lake and Heber valleys. So we have one location in Heber, and we have 4 stationary sites in the Salt Lake Valley, as well as that mobile tracks train that goes throughout Salt Lake. And these all combine together to help us characterize urban CO2 emissions. So really focused on kind of how the urban environment and how humans contribute to carbon dioxide emissions and how those emissions change over time. So again, this is a long-term network. So as I mentioned, Uinta Basin, we've been measuring about 10 years. In the urban setting and in Salt Lake City specifically, we've been measuring since 2001. So we have about 24 years of continuous urban CO2 measurements. And yeah, that really helps us characterize how these emissions change over time as the land and the urban environment change over time as well. Yeah, and with that, there's a really kind of key component that makes this whole network possible and allows us to maintain it for as long as we are. And I'm going to pass it over to Maria, who's going to talk about that part of it.
All right, thank you, Megan. Whoop, I trip over this.
Hi, my name is Maria Garcia, and I am a staff member in the LAIR group. And as Megan just mentioned, we've been making measurements of CO2 since 2001 and methane since 2015. And these long-term ground measurements provide continuous high-resolution greenhouse gas data, enabling both trend and seasonal variation tracking. They also validate and calibrate satellites, ensuring remote sensing accuracy. But how do we ensure that the measurements are accurate and globally comparable? The WMO Central Calibration Lab ensures that greenhouse gas data is reported on a uniform scale for direct comparison. Many labs purchase standards directly from the CCL lab, but this can become very expensive and limit the ability to regularly calibrate instruments. We don't purchase our tanks from the CCL lab, so how do we calibrate our instruments? We have replicated the CCL gas filling system on our campus. We also maintain standards that have been propagated from WMO primary standards. This allows us to create our own tanks and calibrate our instruments. Filling and calibrating our tanks tied to the WMO is the strength of our network and allows us to continue to make these long-term measurements. We also participate in the WMO round robin. What this means is that we participate in this exercise where 2 tanks are sent to participating labs, and each lab makes measurements of the mole fraction and reports back to CCL. And how do we compare? These are the results from the 2015 round robin. Unfortunately, the most recent results are currently unavailable. The bottom row of this table are all the participating labs, and they have measured, including us, the exact same gas cylinders. And then these are the measurements that are reported back. The University of Utah is denoted by that green arrow. As you can see, that we meet the Northern Hemisphere recommended level of 0.1 ppm in CO2. This is how the WMO ensures accuracy among all the participating labs. And lastly, this coming summer, we're going to be moving into our new facility, and we hope to improve our gas filling capabilities. We currently have some issues. We've been filling in biology for quite some time, but in 2020, biology installed growth chambers, and they have these exhausts that create high levels of water vapor that come in through our inlet and wreak havoc on our filling. In addition, we get CO2 and methane spikes from the human activity around the building. So in the new building, we'll have an inlet on the top of the roof, and hopefully we'll have better mixing and easier filling tanks. I'm going to turn it over to Haley Humble, who talked to us about other urban measurements.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, my name is Haley Humble. I'm a graduate student in the LAIR group, and along with the amazing CO2 measurements that Maria and Megan facilitate, I also work with NOx-CO and starting hopefully to work with ozone as well. And I look at the urban and local scale and focusing on emission sectors, but primarily the vehicle emission sectors. So I like to joke that these are what we call our blue boxes instead of black boxes. But these are teledyne instrumentation that measures carbon monoxide, NO2, at NOx, and then ozone. And so me and Megan primarily facilitate the calibration and maintenance of these. And those are in the 8th floor of the University of Utah, William Browning Building lab. And then over here, I wanted to highlight the other sites that I look at. So this is the University of Utah in blue. That's where these blue boxes are, along with the CO2 measurements that we also facilitate. And then we have Rose Park, Sugar House, and Hawthorne. And I wanted to overlay with the map the stilt footprints that are the
averaged the average still footprints that we look at for the different sites, so we can kind of see where the potential emission sources are coming from. And then with that being said, why do we look at these pollutants and these air quality species along with CO2? Well, there's quite a few reasons. One, 3 of them, ozone, NO2 and CO, are criteria pollutants monitored by the EPA. CO2 is an important tracer of fossil fuel combustion, so again, focusing on vehicle emissions. And then NOx, CO2, and CO are emissions of co-emitted species from vehicles. And this is, we're looking at different long-term trends again. So we're using the CO2 data from our Sugar House site in conjunction with the CO and NOx from Hawthorne. And what these are the enhancements. So that is the baseline, or excuse me, the background level subtracted from the concentrations that we see at the site. And what this is, it's a good way for us to determine the anthropogenic emissions as an estimate. And then over here, we see that NOx and CO, we have these notable decreases over time. And then we see that CO2 remains relatively stable with minor variations throughout the long-term trends. And then with that, I also want to note that we did have convergence between the weekday and weekend enhancements. And so a lot of the other group members we talked, so we have Aaron who talked about the ratios, and what we can do with this is if we focus on the enhancements, so our best guess of what we're emitting as forms of combustion efficiency, different sectors emit different ratios based on how well they're actually efficiently combusting whatever fossil fuels they're emitting. And so when we focus on the ratios, so CO to CO2 and NOx to CO2, we see that they're primarily being driven by NOx and CO, and that we still see these convergences between the weekday and weekend ratios. And so these are the observed ratios. And what we can do is that we can look at the simulated enhancements and simulated ratios using our modeling and emission inventories to kind of give our best guess at what actually could be causing the decline or influencing it based on the various sectors of emissions. And so we have here, we talked about stilt, and with that we convolve the stilt footprints convolved with emission inventories. So it's like a gridded spatial emission inventory of the various sectors that we can look at within the Salt Lake Valley. And the stilt footprint allows us to focus on what could be contributing to potentially the Hawthorne site itself. This data is estimated for spring 2020 at Hawthorne. And because we know that NOx is driving the decrease in the NOx to CO2 ratios, if we focus on NOx, we can see that between the weekday and weekends that we have large percentages of diesel and gasoline emitted NOx emissions from those sectors. And with that, we're able to compare the relative influence of each sector. And yeah, and the one thing I did want to mention here is that for the diesel is previous studies have seen larger percentage contributions to the total emissions of NOx. However, because of where our site is located, it's most likely that we are seeing these higher percentages of gasoline due to more passenger vehicle traffic, whereas other studies have focused more like on the highways with mobile platforms. So for spring 2020 Hawthorne, again, because those CO to CO2 ratios were driven mostly by CO, let's focus on CO. And overwhelmingly, we see that for weekday and weekend that we have the largest percentage contribution from gasoline. This is what we expected based on previous work. The one thing that I did want to note and find interesting is that we did see, again, those convergence between the weekday and weekend ratios over those long trends. And this is suggesting and pointing to, if we look at off-road, yes, it is a smaller sector. However, the ratio for it is 30.1, which is quite large, higher than what we have for gasoline. And it goes down to 6.6 for the weekend. And the off-road sector, that's lawn equipment, recreational, construction, machinery, and agricultural equipment. And so With looking at the observed and simulated enhancements of emissions and the ratios in comparison with the CO2 and the combustion efficiency thereof, we can start to deduce what actually could be causing the decline in long-term emissions. And it's suggesting that on-road diesel and gasoline sources are driving both NOx and CO emissions, but then there are nuances between the weekday and weekend long-term trends that could be related to other sources and off-road sources. And so I focused on stationary sites and looking at the long term of these mobile emissions, but James is going to talk about kind of mobile platforms and looking at similar things.
Hi, I'm James Minot. I'm a PhD student working on urban methane emissions. And I want to start off by kind of giving some motivation why we're focusing on methane. As Aaron mentioned, our group has done a lot of work on CO2 in the past decade from folks like Dr. Logan Mitchell and Dr. Derek Malia. But now there's been this kind of shift towards methane with Aaron, myself, and Nick Hoffman, who's present some of his work. And why is that? So since the Industrial Revolution, methane has contributed a third towards global warming, and then zooming in, contribute about 20% to greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. Methane compared to CO2, it warms the planet 81 times more over 20 years, but it has a shorter lifetime of about 9 years compared to roughly 100 or so for CO2. What does this mean? This means that we can use methane in the short term to really pull back on our global warming in order to give us more time to deal with CO2. Additionally, as kind of Aaron and Megan pointed out, methane is associated with natural gas. So there's this economic component to methane. And then finally, methane acts as a precursor to tropospheric ozone, which is hazardous to human health. And so there are air quality benefits to reducing methane. As a few people pointed out, we have been measuring methane and CO2, as well as in collaboration with the Horrell and Mendoza groups, other air quality pollutants on tracks for approximately 10 years or so. Here I'm showing the average methane concentrations over that entire span. And you can see that methane is very hot spotty. For the most part, it's this general blue color, about 2 ppm or so. But then we have some really noticeable points where we can see things like a landfill, which is a persistent source. And then we also have things like industry. Here we believe this is a glass manufacturer, which is more of an episodic source. Because tracks crosses the valley, multiple times a day, almost every day, this is a really unique data set that isn't really available anywhere else in the world that lets us dive deeper into these individual sources. But like many of us here, I'm interested in the emissions, not in what's actually in the air. And so in the forward model, we have our emissions throughout the valley. It gets blown around by some transport, and we end up with some concentrations that we've measured over the past 10 years. However, in the inverse model, we actually measure concentrations of methane. We have a pretty good idea of how the winds work, and using John Stilt model, we can go backwards in time to figure out where our emissions come from. How do I do this exactly? I use what's called a Bayesian inversion, where I take some prior information, and you'll notice that this is extremely coarse at about 0.01 degrees. I then add that together with my concentration information, weighting these two by my uncertainty. And so you can see that there's a lot of work that needs to go into this to balance these scales, where we can then take our stilt and end up with our emissions estimate. And folks like Dr. Derek Malia, who is a part of the LAIR group, has proven this using tracks and CO2. And like I said, you can see CO2 is not nearly as hot spotty. It's a lot of sources and sinks throughout the valley. So this is just proof of concept, and now I'm trying to do it with the more complicated methane. But we've had other really cool special data sets in the Salt Lake Valley. In 2019 and 2020, we had the Google Street View cars driving around essentially every day, and they were outfitted with different instruments, including a methane sensing and methane analyzer. And we have this amazing data set where we can we see methane hotspots throughout the valley. Here we're focusing on the landfill. And John used this data set to develop a method for identifying local unknown point sources. More recently, we had what we called the summer ozone study campaigns. There was 2 of them, both by NOAA and UDAC, where we had multiple vehicles, airplanes, driving around the valley, really trying to get a handle on our ozone. But like I said, ozone is related to methane, and so there are co-benefits for measuring both. And so I'm able to use this data set to dig a little deeper into some of our sources. And we were also able to measure ethane, which is co-emitted from fossil fuel sources. And this allows us to do things like where we can see that in our refineries, we have both methane and ethane, but then in areas like the wetlands, we have methane, but no ethane. Nick Hoffman, who is a master's student in the group, couldn't be here today. He is also working on methane, and he is using the summer ozone study data to do what we call chemically fingerprint. And so he's looking at known sources, diving into the chemical compounds of those known sources. So then when we see an unknown source, we can maybe have an idea of what we're looking at. Additionally, within the Salt Lake Valley, and here I'm kind of zooming back out, bringing in context at maybe the subregional and the regional scale. We've had an aircraft called the Methane LAIR fly over the valley a few times. This is in collaboration with EDF and Harvard. And this gives us, high resolution map at a single point in time of methane within the valley. And we can see things like those landfills and our refinery row. But methane LAIR really is a precursor for methane sat, which launched about a year ago, and we should be getting some good images soon. Methane sat is high resolution, will revisit weekly, and is publicly available and free to use. All this to say that really what we like to do, and similar to what Aaron's trying to set up in the Uinta Basin, is a real-time methane emissions monitoring system where we leverage things like the long-term towers that Megan and Maria talked about, the TRACS data set, the column-based EM27 and butterfly instruments that Aaron talked about, airplane and satellite information, and such as kind of like what Lauren was talking about. And then our mobile observations would kind of give us a more detailed look at individual sources, tying those all into the Bayesian framework so we can monitor methane on a real-time level, really putting Salt Lake on the map as one of the few cities in the world that has a good handle on their methane emissions. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to John to conclude.
Hey, so this is the last slide. And I was thinking how to finish this really broad and multi-scale talk, but I think I'll end on a different tone, which is a note of gratitude. And I think especially these days when we're kind of overwhelmed by the news, sometimes pretty negative news, I think it's worth thinking about what could go right, not what could go wrong, because there's so many things we should be appreciative of, and certainly I am. As you can see, you can understand why I appreciate the wonderful people in the research group. Also want to thank our collaborators. There's a lot of collaborators that are involved in our work, in particular, the dedicated federal employees or former employees that often work sort of silently but steadily in research. And I also want to thank staff, which help us, all of us, on a daily basis. Alex, Noah, and for myself, Leanna as well on the accounting side. And also colleagues, you know, when I think about what's special about this department, it's the collaborations, the collegiality. I want to especially call out and thank John Horrell, Daniel Mendoza, he's not here, Danette Howler. And it's really through these collaborations that we've built up, I think you can see how special the Salt Lake Valley of Northern Utah is. You know, the amount of measurements we have, the kind of science we can do is really unparalleled. That has brought collaborators from around the nation to come here. So I really wanted to thank you know, my colleagues and many people. So with that, let me conclude, and please give people in the front row a big hand. So I know we went through a lot, but I think now that we have, I think we have 10 minutes. Yeah, please fire away.
For Aaron, can you describe the butterfly sensor? a little
Yeah,
bit more?
do you want to come up?
Yeah, sure. So the sensor was developed by someone named Josh Paul. He has built a couple different sensor companies, including the technology behind LGR, Los Gatos, and the ARIS sensors that use methane and ethane. What he's essentially done is created a measurement technique that instead of using open optics, so the EM27 is they're gold-plated mirrors where you're reflecting light into an open optical cavity, and replace that with fiber optic cables and what's called a microetalon. It allows you to very precisely control temperature to be able to scan through a narrow spectral band that includes methane and CO2, and then really using a lot of off-the-shelf type robotics, servo motors, et cetera, that allow you to control the angle of the inlet essentially that you're looking at. Have really, well, one, there's no laser involved, which there is a laser in the EM27, which is the biggest cost. All of that has really helped drive down the cost of these instruments from 150,000 for an EM27 to we're anticipating 10,000 or so for a butterfly instrument. Slightly lower resolution, but the ability to set these up in a network framework is something that's never been done before. The most EM27s in one location has been 5. And so this would allow us to put 20 in a basin, something like that. Happy to talk more about the specifics with anybody as well.
Other question? Yeah, or,
This is more for the urban rural texture, right? Like we have such an awesome data set because we have the view and we're in a basin and we have oil refineries and landfills. You know, other cities don't have those abilities to track their emissions.
Yeah.
Is there a way that we can use what we learn about Salt Lake City to infer the emissions from other?
That's a really great question. Yeah, so there are various ways to do that. I think Lauren briefly talked about satellites and trying for satellites you can go global. So that's one thing. What we have here is be able to zoom very closely into different neighborhoods, and an example of that is the work that Derek led using our measurements to look at how much CO2 declined during the shutdown and which parts of the valley contributed how much to the decline. So there's sort of that level of high resolution, process level understanding that hopefully we can bring to other cities as well. I have to say that it's still relatively basic, this type of urban monitoring and understanding. So I think what has happened really is other people coming here to do measurements because we have so much complementary measurements that they can leverage. Yeah, I think I saw enough. Was it Thomas? Yeah.
I have a clarification question and maybe a follow-up to it.
Yeah.
The still model is not an actual, it doesn't have a dynamical core, you're using a different model that.
Correct. It's an offline Lagrangian, so you have to drive it with a met field, correct?
So I assume that the resolution of the dynamics are very coarse, but all of them around here are
Right.
very.
So the interpolation, I think the answer probably, so we interpolate the net field, the wind vectors especially, but also theta and Q and all those, your favorite net variables. It's all interpolated. But
So.
yeah.
Well, diffusion and turbulence is difficult and complicated. And how do you have ways of handling, or how worried are you that the interpolated field is going to be much smoother than any realistic field if it were to be simulated at a very fine scale like that?
Yeah, I certainly worry about it, especially in the urban canopy, I'll be honest.
Like, have you ever simulated a very high resolution model and compared just for like an hour or whatever you could simulate, or I don't know.
Yeah, other people have done it. So like collaborators at Penn State have done that. Also Berkeley, Tina Chow's group has done that. And you sort of, it's always this difficult game of once you go down that, they simulate for 1 hour and then you identify differences, but then it's 1 hour. So we have like 20 years of data, right? So always that scaling problem, but it's still, I think, to be solved. And maybe these days with AI and ML, that's where the field will be going.
With the Salt Lake City methane campaign,
Yeah.
how did you guys choose your priors? Like, did you have like a plane data, or
You wanna take
was
that?
there like one day we had the data and use that as the priors, or you just like look at the biggest emissions in Salt Lake City and say those are the priors? I'm just curious on how you.
Well,
Yeah.
so for my version right now, the prior I'm using is from the EPA, which is the really coarse group. You want to go to the next one?
Next one, okay.
More. So you can see that's like the prior I'd start with, which is much coarser than I would like. And so what I'm working on now is using, and what people have done in the past is using that mobile observations, those really high, street level observations to kind of add some detail to the prior that I have. And then, but ultimately, what we'll do in like the real-time framework is my previous poster will become my prior, right?
Right.
I think what James has highlighted is we have this super rich data set. It's actually kind of a challenge to combine all of these because these are at different scales, even within this valley, you have really very local scale data, and then you have this wonderful line, and then you have this kind of airborne remote sensing and then satellite remote sensing. So no one around the world really that I know has combined all of these in a single, but we could potentially do that. Actually. Brenda.
I wondered if you could say a little bit about the history of the CO2 network, and we know that this long-term record is building off of decisions made by people along.
Absolutely. Oh, why do you ask? Yeah. Unfortunately, we haven't had time to talk about. I mean, we are standing on the shoulders of giants in many ways. So
Isn't it the longest urban record on Earth?
Yes. The longest urban CO2 record on Earth, and the giants, I'll name a few. Jim Elleringer, Diane Pataki, Dave Bowling. It's really the biologists that started this. I wasn't here when 20 years ago, right? But I inherited this really important foundation, including the calibration lab that Maria talked about. That's why it's in biology, right? No, I didn't do that, but those folks started it. And they had the foresight. I think Diane did this as a postdoc project, when she was here, and she wanted to understand urban CO2. We're still doing that. And to be honest, it's been continue with this patchwork of 3-4 year funding. Right now, this is supported by NOAA, and you can see, this is the kind of, I'll be honest, that the state should take over, like the state Utah Division of Air Quality. They have their suite of measurements, adding CO2, methane, adds a lot to that, just adding them as additional tracers. So they haven't taken on the offer yet, but a number of times I've offered our infrastructure, our expertise. They could be the ones to take it. So hopefully someday. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are at the end now. Let's thank everybody one more time.
Right, yeah, we're going bowling 15 minutes. So, I'm bowling.
John, I think you said it's a record.